Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Proponents, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism with fellow editors and fellow Marks, Marc LiVecche and Mark Melton. Today, of course, is the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington, D.C., as well as the terrible plane crash in Pennsylvania. And so we're going to strive for a Christian reflection on those events. I can recall vividly in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 a conversation at the National Press Club here in Washington, D.C., featuring three of America's most prominent Christian ethicists, Jean Bethke Elshtain, James Turner Johnson, and Stanley Hauerwas. Hauerwas, of course, being an adamant pacifist, rejecting all violence in all circumstances. James Turner Johnson being a distinguished just war scholar, and Jean Bethke Elshtain, of course, subscribing to just war teaching. So it was an extremely vigorous exchange, which I thought left Stanley Hauerwas in tatters, simply issuing quips and one-liners, but no intellectual defense for his perspective. So I was interested today to read a reprinted prayer from Stanley Hauerwas, ostensibly written 30 minutes after the 9/11 implosions at the World Trade Center in New York, in which Hauerwas essentially says America now feels what Iraq has felt for years beneath American bombs, a rather callous and historically inaccurate response. And also I have in mind an editorial today from the editor-in-chief of the Jesuit magazine America, in which the editor offers his own personal forgiveness to Al-Qaeda for their crimes. So with those responses in mind, let me cut to a likely very different reaction to the events of 9/11 from our own just war scholar, Marc LiVecche. What say you on this day of anniversary 19 years later?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'd be channeling my inner Elshtain. She's a bit of a queer voice for a guy like me, but anything I have to say about Elshtain, or anything I have to say about 9/11 would be said with Elshtain's accent. I remember that particular, the give and take between Johnson and Elshtain and Hauerwas, and you're right, he was left in tatters, because I think both Jean and Jim demonstrated the vacuousness of the pacifist position on issues like this. 9/11 was a horrific tragedy, and to suggest, as Hauerwas does, that Christian anger is somehow misplaced is foolish, and it's unchristian. We worship a God who flips over tables at injustices. We worship a God whose external expression of internal grief is very often wrath, as Rabbi Joshua Heschel said. There is a place for anger in the Christian life, and among those many places are grievous assaults on the innocent, like 9/11. I remember my own experience of 9/11. I was in Turkey, driving with a bunch of Americans to Diyarbakir, which is a city in southeast Turkey, which is very often one of the seats of Kurdish separatism. And so we're going into a region that had been racked by terrorist activity for decades. And we grieved about 9/11 with people who themselves have grieved over their own terrorist assaults, and discovered that within, obviously Islam and Christianity, there is a place for this kind of rage at those who would assault the innocent. It prompted my own move into military ethics. Prior to September 11, 2001, I was just organizing sport camps for children in Eastern Europe and parts of the Middle East, and occasionally dabbling in philosophic or moral theological discussions. And I'm fairly well known in Providence circles for talking about the Holocaust as sort of my own kind of great awakening to moral issues. But the thing that sort of pushed me over the edge was 9/11. And what I saw is the inadequate Christian responses to that tragedy, the calls for immediate forgiveness without repentance on the part of Al-Qaeda, the call for a pacifist reaction rather than the pursuit of justice, the call apparently to ignore the loss of victims rather than to vindicate their memories and to demonstrate their human worth by seeking appropriate levels of justice. That's the tact I would take. That's the tact Gene took, Jim Johnson, and really all the great thinkers of the Christian just war tradition, which demonstrates its superiority for demonstrating the merits of Christian intellectualism. It's superior to the pacifist position, which leaves us with nothing but platitudes.
Mark Melton, forgiving Al-Qaeda. What are your thoughts?
I was thinking about Tim Keller. I believe it was Tim Keller in Prodigal Prophet. I was reading, and he was talking about how, in some ways we want a God of anger who will bring about justice, kind of what LiVecche was mentioning earlier, where we don't want a God who just kind of glosses over the pains and sufferings that we deal with. Now, of course, for those who accept Christ, the punishment that we would receive is put upon him. And that really kind of highlights just how serious sin is that punishment is placed on him. And I think there's a difference here that some people kind of conflate the idea of vengeance and retribution and justice. So if you look at this and be like, well, we have to go get vengeance. Well, I don't believe that's the just war tradition's stance, if I'm, presenting it correctly. The idea is justice and retribution. And I think the difference there is vengeance is almost unlimited. There's a verse I read about God being angry at a city and sucking the waters dry. I'd have to look up the exact verses, but that to me is that's a big deal. But for us, we have for Christians, we have to do proportionality. That's for God to do his vengeance. But for the just war tradition, with a legitimate authority, it's responsible for protecting the community and in ensuring justice, and that includes retribution. And so within that, I think a soldier can still forgive his enemy, but still carry out justice. I'll let LiVecche speak on how the mechanics of that work out, maybe give me some better citations, but those are just some of my initial thoughts there.
And Marc LiVecche, this proposal that Christians never believe in vengeance, but doesn't the church historically teach that the state is ordained to carry out retribution in a just cause?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of Jean's famous statements regarding 9/11 was her description of watching the buildings collapse in the presence of others on television. And she turned to a friend and she said, "Now we remember what governments are for." And she's channeling exactly that sentiment, that in an age in which private individuals ought not to use even public violence or public force for private gain, or even for public gain, because that leads to cycles of violence and all sorts of things. The Christian message isn't to leave those people helpless. It's to take private force and to make it public force, and to bring in a magistrate who harnesses public force for the sake not of private gain, but of public good. And that is the role of the magistrate. Under the just war tradition, the sovereign is he over whom there is no one greater, charged with the care of the political community. And that care is expressed through the pursuit, the acquisition and the maintenance of order and justice, which are the two primary ingredients of civic peace. So it is absolutely a divine mandate for the sovereign to care for the polity by seeking appropriate measures of justice and order for the sake, with the intent, of ultimately peace. So it is absolutely the Christian tradition.
I know it's a frequent confusion for Christian opponents of capital punishment that the execution of a convicted murderer is an act of vengeance by society, but Christianity traditionally teaches that the state is not acting on behalf of society in that situation, but rather is an arm of God's vengeance. in performing that act of justice. And I assume that has application to just war teaching as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not vengeance. Mark Melton touched on the word retribution. To retribute is to pay back. That has immediately within its own definition the notion of proportionality. That you pay back, you retribute that which has been given. And so when somebody does an act of charity, to pay that back, is with gratitude and thankfulness. When somebody commits an injustice, you pay that back by acknowledging the injustice and demanding repentance, vindicating victims, which is to say that you acknowledge when you punish evil that the victims of that evil have worth and they have dignity. And when you don't punish that evil, willingly don't punish that evil, then you are suggesting that the victims have no worth, or you are ignoring their worth. It's a truism that mercy always costs somebody something. And folks like Hauerwas are apparently perfectly happy that the people who pay the costs of mercy are the victims of the original act of violence. And that is not just unchristian and uncharitable, it's insane. You can't run a society like that. Forgiveness ought to come, but forgiveness has stages. And, we've written about this before in the pages of Providence. Nigel Bigger has done excellent work on this. What Malone seems to be calling for in forgiving Al-Qaeda could be passable if what he means by that is, look, there's an understanding of forgiveness that begins with compassion. It recognizes that if you change the story, if you change the names, if you give, some terrorist's history to me, and I'm raised in his culture, with his values, with his hurts, with his angers, with all the baggage that makes him who he is. Well, if that was my history, I might be some, fanatical buckwad who drives planes into buildings and kills the innocent myself. And so there has to be a sense of compassion, because I don't know how one's personal history interpenetrates with their will and their actions. So you acknowledge that. You say, but for the grace of God, there goes me. So that's forgiveness is compassion. And that is incumbent upon Christians, regardless of what our assailants do. But we get really confused and we think that forgiveness is compassion means forgiveness as reconciliation, which requires that our enemies recognize the evils that they've done, that they have credibly turned away from those evils and given us reason to believe that they have stood down, that they have repented, that they seek to make restitution. It's only then, after the
Marc LiVecche, you have frozen in place as you sit there in a classroom. So perhaps Mark Melton and I will continue this conversation, as I will note in transition that we have just completed the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. I say we've completed. It was virtually unacknowledged this year, partly because of the coronavirus, obviously, but I think also simply by the fact that those who have actual memories of World War II are almost entirely gone from the scene. And so perhaps we should ponder that 9/11 looms so large for us today, 19 years later, but it too will largely be forgotten as a firsthand experience. And we'll certainly witness that next year with the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. When I was a boy, young man, society was still full of plenty of people who had direct memories of Pearl Harbor, which was similar to 9/11, but had even much wider ramifications. I'll also note, Mark Melton, that we were told after 9/11 that the struggle against Al-Qaeda and similar Islamist terror groups would be a multi-generational struggle, and perhaps it will be, but 19 years later, we seem to be almost setting aside that struggle and pivoting towards focus on China as our strategic adversary, perhaps into a Cold War equivalent of struggle with China, which itself may be a multi-generational struggle. Pivoting further, Mark Melton, and perhaps on a final note, you published in Providence today an article from 75 years ago from a Presbyterian ecumenist and missionary leader describing from his perspective the limits of religious freedom in the wake of Nazism and Japanese militarism. He suggests in that Nazism and the extreme Shintoism that backed up the Japanese tyranny were religious zealotries that should be repressed, and therefore there should be limits on religious freedom. And of course, who shall be the determiners of those parameters? He thinks there needs to be a global standard, but interestingly suggests the global ecumenical church should be the arbiter of that standard, although Christians as today are a minority in the world. He also makes absolutely no reference to America's First Amendment and our belief that all forms of speech should, not all behavior, but all forms of speech are permitted. But he asserts that some forms of not just actions, but also forms of speech should be constrained. So what are your thoughts, Mark?
So to kind of backtrack on the first thing about the multi-generational aspect of the fight with terrorism, I was talking with someone earlier today. We'll produce the podcast and have it out next week, and we actually talked about ISIS, and it's still going on, and kind of the idea of like ISIS 2.0 is still hanging around the Middle East. And so it may be multi-generational fight still, but it may not be front page news as much. I think we also see it in Nigeria and other places. And so Americans may not be thinking about it on a day-to-day basis, but I still think it's still there and it's going to be there for a while. But now to pivot to this article, a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if it was on the Marksism call or some other conference call we had, that you mentioned that it didn't seem like Reinhold Niebuhr wrote a lot about international religious liberty, and I ran across this article in 45 where he doesn't talk about it, but someone else does, and so kind of ran it just to kind of see like how does this compare and contrast with some of the other articles that we run about international religious liberty. I've noticed some comparisons, some similarities. For instance, he brings up, if I get the line here correctly, that, let me scrolling down here. Let me see. Recent experience has shown only too conclusively that where this liberty, religious liberty, is endangered, all other liberties are likewise placed in jeopardy. I think that kind of rings similar to what Tom Farr and some other writers in Providence have written. But again, like you said earlier, like he seems to equate Nazism as a type of religion as opposed to a type of nationalism. He also says like Marxist atheism. Now, how Marxist atheism is exactly different from just any other run-of-the-mill atheism, I'm not sure. It could have just been sloppy writing there, but he kind of equates these two as religions, not just ideologies, and that they must be repressed. And what I find interesting is that in the United States, we don't repress these. If you want to be a communist, you can. If you want to be a Nazi, you can. We have organizations that do that. Now, they get, every time you have someone like the KKK or someone like that do something, they generally have protests in opposition to them. But we don't repress them, but we also treat them as political thought. We treat them more as it's a First Amendment freedom of speech. It's not a religious liberty issue. But it's interesting to me that, again, he's writing during the fighting of World War II, so I can see where he might have a slightly different slant on that then. But, and there was something else here that I thought was kind of bizarre. But yeah, like you said, where he thought the ecumenical church should somehow be the arbiter of what is the moral law. And it seems like he kind of completely forgets that Islam existed, that Islam was pretty global, stretching across continents, and took a lot of adherents, but he kind of glosses over that and it's like, well, Christianity is the biggest. So there is a kind of arbitrary of like, who's going to determine this, who has the right to determine the moral rights or the moral law. So yeah, those are kind of a rundown, some of my thoughts. I thought it was a little bit weird on a few points, but there's a few things that we still talk about today. Oh, one thing I do remember that I was thinking about was how he did, like you say, he doesn't talk anything about American constitutional law on the First Amendment. He mentions the Mormon Church, which I think the Supreme Court case that he would be alluding to would have been in the 1879 or so. But there was others more recent to his time of writing this that dealt with the restrictions of vaccinations. Like, can the state force you to get a vaccination even if your religion says that's not okay? And the Supreme Court, a decade or so before he wrote this, they said no, the government can force you to get a vaccination. And I think that would have been a very significant international or restriction on religious liberty that would have been going on within his own day that he just completely ignores. So yeah, it's an
Well, it was
era.
a novel approach to religious liberty that would be somewhat at odds with perspectives today from most of our friends who are religious liberty scholars and advocates. Well, that concludes this latest episode of Marksism. We remember with prayer and meditation those who died this day 19 years ago. May their memory be everlasting, and may we learn the appropriate lessons from their sacrifices. Thank you for listening to Marksism. Till next week, bye-bye.